Sometimes the most unlikely people become family when life tears everything else away. In 1873, 6-year-old Rosalie cries alone in the Arizona desert after raiders killed everyone she loved. Her wagon train lies in ruins behind her, and she hasn't eaten in 3 days. The sun burns her skin and her voice grows weaker. Then Apache hunter Yaholo finds her. This weathered man lost his own wife and children to soldiers 15 years ago. He sees something in her scared eyes that reminds him of his own pain. His people and her people are enemies, but he can't leave a child to die. He takes her home. What starts as simple kindness grows into something deeper. Over the years, he teaches her to survive in his world, and she teaches him to hope again. But when white settlers come looking for her, can love be stronger than the hate between their races? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before that moment of discovery in the desert, the Whitman family wagon rolled steadily westward through the morning light of the Arizona territory. Rosalie sat between her mother and father on the wooden bench, her small hands clutching a corn-husk doll her grandmother had made back in Missouri. The September sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, and her father hummed an old hymn as the oxen plodded forward. "Papa, how much farther to California?" Rosalie asked, swinging her legs against the wagon's side. Her father, Thomas Whitman, adjusted his hat against the glare. "Oh, maybe 6 more weeks, little bird. We'll be there before the first snowfalls in the mountains." Her mother, Margaret, smoothed Rosalie's blonde curls. "And won't Uncle James be surprised to see how much you've grown? He hasn't seen you since you were 3 years old." The wagon train stretched ahead of them, 12 families seeking new lives in the fertile valleys of California. Behind them rolled the supply wagons, cattle, and dreams of prosperity. Children ran alongside the slow-moving oxen, their laughter mixing with the creak of wooden wheels and the gentle lowing of livestock. Rosalie pressed her face against her mother's blue calico dress, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender soap and sunshine. She didn't know these would be among her last moments of pure happiness, that by sunset her world would be reduced to ash and memory. The attack came without warning, just after the noon meal. Apache raiders, their faces painted for war, swept down from the red rocks like desert ghosts. The peaceful procession erupted into chaos as arrows whistled through the air and war cries echoed off the canyon walls. Thomas Whitman reached for his rifle but fell before his hands found the stock. Margaret screamed, pulling Rosalie close as their wagon lurched to a violent stop. In those terrible minutes, everything Rosalie had ever known disappeared. When the dust settled and the raiders melted back into the desert, 12 families had become scattered bones, bleaching under the merciless sun. Only one small girl remained, hidden beneath her mother's still form, clutching a piece of torn blue cloth. 40 miles away, Yaholo moved through the pre-dawn darkness like a shadow given substance. His moccasined feet found purchase on stone ledges that would crumble under a white man's boots. At 45, his body bore the lean strength of a lifetime in the desert, every muscle and sinew adapted to this harsh country. Silver threads ran through his black hair, pulled back and secured with a leather cord. His face, weathered by sun and wind, carried the permanent squint of a man who read survival in the flight of birds and the scent of distant water. Around his neck hung a medicine pouch his wife had made 20 years ago, before the cavalry came to their winter camp. Inside rested her bone hairpin, a small turquoise stone their son had found by the river, and a lock of their daughter's hair, all that remained of the family that soldiers had taken from him one frozen morning in 1858. Yaholo paused on a granite outcrop, studying the valley below. His trained eye caught movement near a waterhole, a small herd of deer picking their way to drink. He knocked an arrow to his bowstring, drew back the sinew with practiced ease, and released. The doe dropped cleanly, her death providing life for his people. As he field-dressed his kill, memories drifted through his mind like smoke. his wife Itzel singing softly as she wove baskets by firelight. His son Nalnish, 8 years old, practicing with his small bow. His daughter Ayana, only 5, following him everywhere with questions about every bird, every track, every cloud in the sky. They had been his world, his reason for greeting each dawn with gratitude. The soldiers had come in winter, when the Apache families sheltered in the protected canyon they had used for generations. Colonel Henderson claimed they had been raiding settlements, though Yaholo's people had been peaceful that season, content to wait out the cold months with their stored food and ancient stories. It hadn't mattered. The cavalry wanted Apache blood, and they took it without distinction between warrior and child. Yaholo had been hunting that morning, tracking an elk through the high country. He returned to find smoke rising from his home, his family's bodies frozen in the snow, his entire world reduced to ashes and silence. For months afterward, he had wandered the desert like a ghost, caring nothing whether he lived or died. Only gradually had the numbness given way to purpose. He would live to remember them, to honor their memory by surviving in the land they had loved. Now, 15 years later, he lived alone in a hidden canyon where water seeped from red sandstone and ancient pines provided shelter. The other Apache respected his solitude, understanding that some wounds never fully healed. They brought him news from the larger world, and he shared his meat when hunting was good. But mostly, he moved through his days in quiet communion with the desert and the spirits of those he had lost. He was walking back toward his canyon home, the doe across his shoulders, when the wind brought him something that made him freeze in his tracks. A child's cry, thin and desperate, carried on the afternoon air. Yaholo set down his burden and climbed to higher ground, scanning the vast expanse of desert stretched below. There, a tiny figure stumbling among the scattered wreckage of wagons, barely visible against the pale earth. Even at this distance, he could see the child's distress, the aimless wandering of someone beyond exhaustion. His first instinct was to turn away. White people brought nothing but sorrow to his kind. Their wars, their diseases, their hunger for land had already cost him everything that mattered. But as he watched, the small figure collapsed and didn't rise again. Somewhere in that desolate scene lay a child who would die if no one helped. Yaholo touched his medicine pouch, feeling the weight of his own losses, and made a choice that would change both their lives forever. The sun was setting by the time he reached the wagon train's remains. Scattered belongings told the story. Clothes and tools and precious family photographs trampled into the dust. Bodies lay where they had fallen, already drawing vultures from the darkening sky. And there, beneath a woman's protective embrace, he found her. Rosalie was unconscious, her small body dehydrated and sunburned, her lips cracked and bleeding. She clutched a torn piece of blue calico dress, all that remained of her mother's last attempt to shield her from harm. Her blonde hair was matted with dust and tears, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. Yaholo knelt beside her, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he checked for injuries. She stirred at his touch, blue eyes opening to focus on his weathered face. For a moment, neither moved. Then she opened her mouth and screamed with what little voice she had left. He expected this. To her, he was everything she had been taught to fear. The savage, the enemy, the monster from children's nightmares. But he had found her, and now she was his responsibility. In Apache tradition, a life saved belonged to the saver until it could be returned to its rightful place. The question that would haunt him for years was whether her rightful place lay with people who had abandoned her to die, or with the man who chose to let her live. Yaholo gathered water from his gourd and held it to her lips. She was too weak to resist, and survival instinct overcame fear as she drank. When she had taken what she could hold, he wrapped her in his blanket and lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, this child who carried the blood of his enemies, this small life that had somehow become his burden and his salvation. As he carried her into the gathering darkness, leaving behind the place where two worlds had collided in violence, Yaholo whispered a prayer to the spirits of his wife and children. Perhaps this was why he had been allowed to survive. not for revenge, not for his own peace, but to save one innocent life from the hatred that had already claimed too many. Behind them, the wind began to cover the wagon train's remains with sand, slowly erasing the evidence of another tragedy in a land that had seen too many. Ahead lay the unknown territory of hearts learning to heal, and enemies discovering they might become family. The desert held its breath, waiting to see what would grow from this unlikely seed of compassion planted in ground watered by too much sorrow. The Apache camp stirred to life as Yaholo approached with his strange burden. Smoke from morning cooking fires rose straight up in the still air, and children who had been playing stopped their games to stare. Women grinding corn looked up from their metates, their faces registering shock and concern. Men reached instinctively for weapons before recognizing Yaholo's familiar silhouette against the dawn sky. Nayeli was the first to approach. At 52, she had been the camp's unofficial grandmother since losing her own children to smallpox years ago. Her graying hair was bound in traditional braids, and her weathered hands had delivered half the babies in the camp. She took one look at the unconscious white child in Yaholo's arms and immediately understood both the complexity of the situation and the urgent need for care. "Bring her to my wiki-up," she said without hesitation, leading the way to her dwelling. "The child needs water, food, and healing before we discuss anything else." But others were not so quick to accept the situation. Kuruk, the war chief, strode forward with several warriors flanking him. His face bore the ritual scars of his rank, and his black eyes held the hardness of a man who had lost too many battles to white enemies. "What madness is this, Yaholo?" Kuruk's voice carried the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "You bring the enemy's spawn into our camp? Have you forgotten what their kind has done to us?" Yaholo met his gaze steadily. "I have forgotten nothing, but I will not let a child die when I have the power to save her." The gathering crowd murmured among themselves. Some nodded approval. The Apache way honored the protection of children, even enemy children. Others shook their heads gravely, seeing only trouble ahead. Word spread quickly through the camp, and soon nearly everyone had gathered in the central area where such important matters were decided. Old Hatali, the camp's medicine man and spiritual leader, emerged from his wiki-up, carrying the ancient ceramic bowl used for mixing war paint. The artifact had been passed down through generations, its sides blackened by age and ceremonial use. Today, instead of paint for battle, it would hold the weight of an impossible decision. "The spirits have brought this child to us," Hatali said, his voice carrying the gravity of his years and wisdom. "We cannot act in haste. This choice will echo through many seasons." Kuruk's jaw tightened. "The spirits bring many things: storms, drought, enemies. We don't welcome them all into our homes." He gestured toward Rosalie, still unconscious in Yaholo's arms. "This child is white. Her people have made war on us for generations. Her blood calls to their blood. Her blood is the blood of innocence," Nayeli interjected firmly. "Look at her, Kuruk. She has perhaps 6 summers. What war has she made on anyone?" "The war her people will make when they come searching for her," another warrior called out. "They will bring soldiers, guns, destruction. We have seen this before." Yaholo shifted Rosalie's weight, feeling how her small body trembled even in unconsciousness. "Her people are dead. I found her among the remains of a wagon train, 3 days' walk from here. She was dying of thirst and heat. If the whites were coming for her, they would have come already. And if they do come," Kuruk demanded, "if soldiers arrive asking questions about a missing white child, what then, Yaholo? Will your kind heart protect us from their bullets?" The question hung heavy in the morning air. Everyone present had lost family or friends to the cavalry's campaign of expansion and punishment. The wounds were still fresh, the mistrust earned through blood and betrayal. Young Ashki, barely 18 and eager to prove his warrior status, stepped forward. "We should take her to the trading post at Copper Creek. Let the whites deal with their own kind. Why should Apache hands be stained by white blood, even to save it?" "Because that is not who we are," said Cochetta, an elder woman whose wisdom was respected throughout the camp. "The Apache have always protected the helpless, regardless of their origin. Our strength comes not from cruelty, but from justice." The debate continued as the sun climbed higher, voices rising and falling like desert wind. Some argued for immediate removal of the child, leave her at a distant white settlement, and let fate decide her future. Others suggested trading her back to her own people for goods or safe passage. A few even whispered darker solutions that made Yaholo's hand move protectively over Rosalie's small form. Throughout the discussion, she remained unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. Nayeli had managed to get small amounts of water between her lips, but clearly the child needed more care than could be provided while standing in the hot sun, arguing about her fate. "Enough," Hatali finally declared, raising the war paint bowl above his head. "The child grows weaker while we debate. Let her live through this day, and tonight we will hold proper council. The spirits will guide us to the right path, but they cannot speak through the cries of a dying child." Kuruk's face darkened with displeasure. "And if she recovers, if she lives to bring destruction upon us, then that burden will be mine to bear," Yaholo said quietly. "I saved her life. By our laws, that life belongs to me until it can be properly returned to its rightful place. I claim the right to speak for her in council." The war chief studied Yaholo's face, reading the determination there. They had known each other for many years, had fought side by side against Mexican raiders and territorial militias. Kuruk understood that Yaholo would not be swayed from this path, regardless of the consequences. "So be it," Kuruk said finally. "But know this, old friend, if soldiers come because of your choice, if blood is spilled because of your soft heart, the responsibility lies with you alone." As the crowd began to disperse, still murmuring among themselves, Nayeli touched Yaholo's shoulder. "Bring her quickly. She burns with fever, and her spirit wanders far from her body. If we are to save her, it must be now." Inside Nayeli's cool wickiup, they laid Rosalie on soft rabbit furs and began the work of healing. Nayeli bathed the child's sunburned skin with cool water and aloe, while Yaholo held her head steady and encouraged her to take sips of broth made from desert roots. Slowly, gradually, color returned to her pale cheeks. When Rosalie finally opened her eyes fully, the terror was immediate and absolute. She screamed until her voice gave out, then continued screaming silently, her small body rigid with fear. To her, these brown faces leaning over her were the faces of nightmares, the enemy her parents had warned her about in hushed bedtime conversations. Yaholo spoke to her in English, his accent thick, but the words gentle. "You safe. No hurt you. You safe now." But safety was a concept that had been torn from Rosalie's world 3 days ago. She had learned that the people who loved her could be killed, that protection was an illusion, that strangers were dangers to be feared above all else. Her blue eyes darted frantically between Yaholo and Nayeli, looking for escape routes that didn't exist. Nayeli began to sing softly, an ancient Apache lullaby that transcended language barriers. The melody was soothing, filled with the warmth of countless mothers comforting countless children throughout the generations. Gradually, Rosalie's panic began to subside, replaced by exhaustion and the simple need to rest. As the sun set and cooking fires were lit throughout the camp, the informal council gathered. The decision they would make tonight would bind them all to a course of action that could lead to peace or catastrophe. In the center of their circle, the war paint bowl sat empty but significant, a reminder that some choices once made could never be undone. Yaholo sat beside Rosalie's sleeping form, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conflicts, new tests of resolve. But tonight, a small white child slept safely in an Apache camp, and for the moment that was enough. The first week in the Apache camp passed like a fever dream for Rosalie. Days blended into nights filled with strange sounds, unfamiliar smells, and faces that belonged to every childhood nightmare her parents had ever whispered about. She slept fitfully, jerking awake at the slightest sound, her small fists clutching the torn piece of blue calico that was all she had left of her mother. Yaholo maintained a careful distance, understanding that his presence terrified her despite his gentle intentions. He would sit just outside Nayeli's wickiup in the early morning hours, whittling small figures from soft wood while keeping watch over the child who had become his responsibility. The Apache children, naturally curious about this strange pale visitor, would gather to watch him work, whispering among themselves in voices too low for adult ears. On the fourth day, Yaholo finished carving a small doll from cedar wood. Its features were simple but carefully rendered, a girl with long hair and a dress that flowed in the wind. It was remarkably similar to one his own daughter had treasured, created by his hands during those long-ago evenings when his family had been whole and happiness had seemed as permanent as the stars. He held the wooden doll up to catch the morning light, remembering Ayana's delighted laughter when he had first placed her treasure in her small hands. She had named the doll Morning Star and carried it everywhere, creating elaborate adventures and conversations that had filled their wickiup with joy. After the massacre, he had found Morning Star buried in the snow beside his daughter's body, and he had carried it with him through months of wandering grief until finally placing it in a sacred cave with the rest of his family's possessions. Now, watching Rosalie's hollow eyes and trembling hands, he understood why the spirits had guided him to carve again. This child needed something to hold on to, something that spoke of care rather than fear. When he approached the wickiup, Rosalie instinctively pressed herself against the back wall, her breathing quick and shallow. But instead of coming closer, Yaholo simply placed the wooden doll near the entrance and withdrew to his customary distance. He spoke no words, made no demands, simply sat and resumed his patient watch. For hours, Rosalie stared at the small carved figure. It was clearly meant for her, but accepting it would mean acknowledging some form of connection with these people who had taken her from everything familiar. Yet the doll was beautiful, crafted with obvious skill and care. Its wooden features seemed kind, its posture suggested movement and life. As the sun reached its peak, her curiosity finally overcame her caution. Moving with the careful stealth of a wild creature approaching a trap, she crept forward and touched the doll with one finger. The wood was smooth and warm, worn soft by patient hands. When nothing terrible happened, she picked it up and held it close to her chest. For the first time since the massacre, Rosalie felt a tiny spark of something other than terror. The wooden doll couldn't speak or laugh like her old cornhusk doll, but it carried within its simple form a message of kindness that transcended language and cultural barriers. Yaholo, watching from his position, felt something ease in his chest. Not quite hope, that was still too dangerous, but perhaps the first stirring of possibility. The child had accepted his gift, had allowed herself this small connection. It was a beginning. Nayeli, who had been observing both child and man with the wisdom of her years, approached with a bowl of the thick corn porridge that sustained the camp. She knelt beside Rosalie and began eating with obvious enjoyment, making small sounds of pleasure. After a few moments, she offered the wooden spoon to the child. Rosalie's first impulse was to refuse, but hunger was becoming more powerful than fear. The porridge was different from anything she had ever tasted, earthier, more complex than the simple foods of her wagon train life. But it filled the aching emptiness in her belly. As she ate, Nayeli continued her gentle presence, occasionally pointing to objects around the wickiup and speaking their Apache names in a soft, encouraging voice. "Bikadi," Nayeli said, touching the blanket. "Bi-adi," Rosalie listened without responding, but her eyes showed she was absorbing these new sounds, filing them away in the part of her mind that was already beginning to adapt for survival. On the seventh day, something remarkable happened. As Yaholo sat in his usual spot, maintaining his respectful distance while keeping watch, Rosalie emerged from the wickiup, carrying her wooden doll. Instead of staying close to the entrance, she walked slowly, hesitantly, to within arm's length of where he sat. She didn't speak, didn't approach any closer, but she settled cross-legged on the ground and began playing quietly with her doll. It was the first voluntary proximity she had allowed, the first sign that she might someday see him as something other than a threat. Yaholo continued his whittling, working on a small wooden horse that would join the doll in what he hoped would become a growing collection of toys. His movements were deliberate and calm, designed to show that he posed no danger to the small girl who was finally allowing herself to exist in the same space. As the morning progressed, Apache children began their usual gathering to watch Yaholo work. Today, however, their attention was divided between his carving and the pale stranger who sat nearby. One brave boy, perhaps 8 years old, crept close enough to touch Rosalie's blonde hair, then darted away giggling when she looked up in surprise. For a brief moment, Rosalie's lips curved upward in what might have been the ghost of a smile. It was such a fleeting expression that Yaholo almost missed it, but he felt its impact like warmth from a distant fire. Somewhere beneath the trauma and terror, the child she had been before the massacre still existed. That evening, as the camp settled into the quiet rhythms of nighttime, Yaholo heard something that made his heart clench with memory and hope. From inside Nayeli's wickiup came the soft sound of a child's voice, barely above a whisper, speaking to her wooden doll. The words were in English, too quiet to understand, but the tone was the universal language of a little girl creating worlds and adventures for her companion. It was the sound of healing beginning, of a young spirit refusing to surrender entirely to despair. Yaholo touched his medicine pouch, feeling the weight of his own losses and the unexpected lightness of new purpose. Perhaps saving this child would not bring back his own family, but it might honor their memory in a way that simple survival never could. Perhaps in teaching her to live in his world, he might remember how to truly live in it himself, the wooden doll, cradled in small arms that were finally beginning to relax, carried within its simple form the beginning of trust between two wounded souls who had found each other in the vast loneliness of the desert. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight carried the promise that healing was possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. 3 months had passed since Yaholo carried a dying child out of the desert, and the transformation was remarkable to behold. Rosalie had grown from a terrified, skeletal waif into something approaching a normal little girl again. Her blonde hair, now clean and braided in the Apache style, caught the morning sun as she helped Nayeli tend the cooking fire. Her sun-darkened skin had lost the painful rawness of those first days, and though she remained small for her age, strength was returning to her limbs. The nightmares still came, violent dreams that would jerk her awake, gasping and crying in the dark hours before dawn. But they were less frequent now, and when they struck, she no longer screamed in terror. Instead, she would clutch her wooden doll and whisper to it in a mixture of English and the Apache words she was rapidly learning, soothing herself back to sleep with the resilience that children possess in abundance. Yaholo had become her constant teacher, though their lessons bore no resemblance to the schooling she might have received in a white settlement. Instead, he taught her to read the desert's subtle language, how to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds, how to identify which plants could sustain life and which brought death, how to move silently across ground that would betray a careless footstep with its singing sand. "Too," he said, pointing to a patch of grass that looked no different from any other to Rosalie's untrained eyes. "Good grass. Animals eat. You find animals here." Rosalie nodded solemnly, filing away this knowledge along with dozens of other survival lessons. Her capacity for learning amazed him, where adult minds might struggle against such radical change. Her young brain absorbed new information with the efficiency of thirsty, ground-drinking rain, but it was language that marked her most dramatic progress. Apache, with its complex tonal variations and guttural sounds, should have been nearly impossible for an English-speaking child to master. Yet Rosalie was acquiring it with startling speed. her ear naturally attuned to the musical rise and fall of conversation around the camp. On this particular morning, as she knelt beside the water source, grinding mesquite pods into flour, she looked up at Nayeli and spoke a complete sentence in carefully pronounced Apache. Shima, Denebizad Shiuhushu. The words meant mother. The Apache language pleases me, and they struck both women like a physical blow. Rosalie had never called anyone mother since losing her birth family, and the casual way she used the term suggested she wasn't even fully aware of what she had said. Nayeli's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away, but not before Yaholo saw them. He understood her emotion perfectly. After years of childlessness, following the death of her own babies, Nayeli was discovering the joy of nurturing again. And Rosalie, whether consciously or not, was accepting that nurturing as a child accepts water when dying of thirst. The moment was interrupted by young Ashki, who came running into camp with news that made everyone's blood run cold. He had been hunting in the high country and had spotted a cavalry patrol camped 2 valleys away. They were clearly searching for something, questioning any Apache they encountered about missing white captives. Kuruk gathered the war council immediately. In the center of their circle sat Nayeli's special beaded bracelet, an intricate piece that had taken her months to complete using traditional patterns passed down through generations. Today, she had planned to present it to Rosalie as a symbol of the child's growing acceptance into their community. Instead, it served as a silent reminder of how much was at stake. They come closer each day, Kuruk said grimly. Yesterday they were 3 days' ride from here. This morning, 2 days. By tomorrow... He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone understood the implications. What do they seek? Asked Cochetta, though she feared she already knew the answer. Ashki glanced uncomfortably at Yaholo before responding. They ask about a white child, a girl with yellow hair. They say she was taken from a wagon train attack and is being held against her will. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Every person present understood the terrible irony. The soldiers were coming to rescue a child who was finally beginning to heal from the trauma their own kind had inflicted upon her. We could move deeper into the mountains, suggested Hatali. The high country has caves where a small group could hide for many seasons and abandon our homes, our sacred places. Kuruk's voice carried the weight of generations who had already been driven from too many ancestral lands. No, we have done nothing wrong. The child came to us dying. We saved her life. Try explaining that to cavalry soldiers, muttered one of the younger warriors. They see what they choose to see, hear what they choose to hear. Yaholo, who had remained silent during the debate, finally spoke. The decision is mine to make. I claimed responsibility for her life. I will face whatever consequences that choice brings, and if they take her by force, Nayeli asked quietly, if they drag her away screaming, believing they are saving her from savages who have filled her mind with lies. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. They all knew Rosalie well enough by now to understand that being separated from her Apache family would be devastating. She had found safety and love here, had begun to trust again after experiencing the worst betrayal possible. To lose this security would likely break something in her that might never heal. Perhaps, said Cochetta thoughtfully, we should ask the child herself what she wishes. It was a radical suggestion. In both Apache and white cultures, children were rarely consulted about adult decisions that affected their lives. But Rosalie was no ordinary child. She had been forced to grow up quickly, had faced choices and losses that would challenge adults. If anyone had earned the right to voice an opinion about her own fate, it was she. They found Rosalie where they had left her, still grinding mesquite pods, but now singing softly to herself in Apache. The song was one Nayeli had taught her, an ancient melody about finding home in unexpected places. When she looked up and saw the serious faces surrounding her, her singing stopped, and the wariness that was never far from the surface returned to her eyes. Yaholo knelt beside her, speaking in English so there could be no misunderstanding. Soldiers come looking for white girl, looking for you. They won't take you back to white people. Rosalie's grip tightened on her wooden doll, and for a moment she looked like the terrified 6-year-old they had found in the desert. But when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. I stay here. This my family now. The beaded bracelet lay forgotten in the dust as the implications of her words settled over the group like a physical weight. A child had chosen her family, but that choice might cost them everything they had worked to build in this harsh and beautiful land. 1 year had passed since that desperate morning in the desert, and if a stranger had wandered into the Apache camp, they would never have guessed that the confident young girl helping prepare for the harvest ceremony had once been a terrified white captive. Rosalie moved through her daily tasks with the easy grace of someone who belonged, her Apache words flowing as naturally as water over stones. The morning of her naming ceremony dawned clear and bright, with the desert air carrying the crisp promise of autumn. For weeks, the camp had been preparing for this sacred ritual, and today Rosalie would receive not just an Apache name, but formal recognition as a true daughter of the people who had raised her from near death. Hatali emerged from his wickiup, carrying the ancient eagle feather that had been blessed by generations of medicine men. The feather was magnificent, longer than a man's hand, its edges perfectly defined, its surface bearing the subtle iridescence that spoke of a bird that had soared close to the spirit world. In Apache tradition, such a feather carried the power to transform, to mark the passage from one life to another. Today, Hatali announced, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony, we welcome a new daughter to our people. She came to us as Rosalie of the White World, but she will leave this circle as Hina, she who survives. The name had been chosen carefully, after much discussion among the elders. It honored both her resilience in surviving the massacre and her courage in adapting to a completely different way of life. More than that, it recognized the strength she had shown in choosing love over fear, family over familiarity. As the ceremony began, Rosalie knelt in the center of the gathered tribe, her heart beating fast with excitement and nervousness. She understood the magnitude of what was happening. This was not just a naming, but an adoption that would bind her to these people for life. When Hatali placed the eagle feather in her dark hair, now grown long and braided with traditional silver ornaments, she felt something shift deep in her chest, a settling that she couldn't quite name, but recognized as the feeling of finally, truly coming home. Yaholo watched from the edge of the circle, his chest tight with emotions he had thought buried forever. This child who had stumbled into his life broken and afraid had become the daughter he never expected to have again. In teaching her to survive in the desert, she had taught him something equally valuable, how to hope beyond the boundaries of loss. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Over the months, he had watched Rosalie's natural curiosity emerge from beneath layers of trauma. She asked endless questions about everything. Why certain plants grew only in shadowed places, how to predict weather from cloud patterns, what the different bird calls meant. Her appetite for learning reminded him achingly of Ayana, his lost daughter, but instead of deepening his grief, it had begun to heal something he thought permanently broken. More remarkably, Rosalie had begun to heal something in him as well. Her presence had drawn him back into the life of the camp in ways he hadn't experienced since before his family's death. People who had respected his solitude for 15 years now sought him out, partly to check on the white child's progress, but increasingly because his involvement with Rosalie had reminded them of the man he used to be, generous, wise, someone worth knowing. Nayeli had been the first to notice this change, and it had sparked something between them that surprised both of them. Their shared care for Rosalie had created opportunities for conversation, for the small kindnesses that grew into deeper affection. When Yaholo brought Nayeli wildflowers, he had gathered while teaching Rosalie to identify medicinal plants. When she saved him the choicest portions of meat from her cooking, they were courtship gestures decades in the making. "She has made us both young again," Nayeli had said one evening as they watched Rosalie play with the other children, her laughter indistinguishable from theirs. "This child who came to us broken has mended things in us we didn't even know needed mending." Their wedding had been a quiet affair, celebrated just 3 months ago when the summer heat had broken, and the first autumn storms had blessed the desert with rain. Rosalie had been overjoyed, understanding instinctively that this meant her makeshift family was becoming official, permanent in a way that gave her security she had never dared hope for again. But not everyone in the camp had embraced these changes with equal enthusiasm. Kuruk, while no longer actively opposing Rosalie's presence, remained skeptical of the wisdom in fully integrating a white child into Apache society. His concerns were not born of cruelty, but of hard experience. He had seen too many attempts at peaceful coexistence end in bloodshed and betrayal. "Today she accepts the feather gladly," he had said to Yaholo the night before the ceremony. "But what happens in 5 years, 10 years, when she's a woman and white men come calling her back to civilization? What happens when she must choose between the comfort of her birth culture and the hardships of ours?" It was a question that haunted Yaholo's quieter moments, though he had never voiced his concerns to Rosalie or Nayeli. He loved this child as completely as if she had been born to him, but he also understood the complexities of identity in ways that a 7-year-old could not yet comprehend. Would the day come when she would look around the camp and see limitations rather than home? When she would wonder what her life might have been like among her own people? For now, such worries seemed unfounded. As the naming ceremony concluded and Hina, no longer Rosalie, rose to accept the congratulations of her people, her face glowed with pure happiness. She had found her place in the world, and it was here, among the red rocks and endless sky, with people who had chosen to love her when love seemed impossible. The celebration continued through the afternoon, with traditional foods and stories that welcomed the newest member of their community. But even as they feasted and sang, scouts brought troubling news from the outer territories. Army patrols were increasing their presence in the region, and rumors spoke of a new commanding officer who was taking a particular interest in reports of white captives living among hostile tribes. Colonel James Whitman had arrived at Fort Apache 2 weeks ago, and his first priority was reviewing all reports of missing persons from the past several years. His dedication to this task was personal in a way that his subordinates didn't understand. Somewhere in this vast territory was his brother's only child, a little girl who had vanished without a trace when raiders attacked the wagon train carrying his brother's family west. The colonel had received word of Thomas Whitman's death and his family's massacre, but no bodies had been found of his sister-in-law Margaret or his beloved niece Rosalie. In his heart, James Whitman held on to the hope that somewhere, somehow, they had survived. He would not rest until he knew their fate, one way or another, as the sun set on Hina's naming day, casting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Two worlds continued their inevitable approach toward a collision that would test every bond of love and loyalty that had been forged in the healing silence of the wilderness. The eagle feather in her hair caught the last rays of daylight, a symbol of transformation and belonging that would soon face its greatest trial. 2 years had passed since the naming ceremony, and 9-year-old Hina moved through her daily routines with the confident efficiency of someone who had never known any life but this one. Her blonde hair, now reaching past her shoulders, was always braided with the skill Nayeli had taught her, adorned with small silver ornaments that caught the desert light. To anyone watching her help prepare morning meals or tend to the camp's children, she appeared to be exactly what she had become, a Apache girl, living the only life she remembered wanting. But memories have a way of surfacing when least expected, and it was while cleaning out a storage area in Nayeli's wiki-up that Hina discovered the carefully wrapped bundle that would shatter her peaceful certainty about who she was and where she belonged. The bundle contained her original possessions, the torn piece of blue calico dress, a small leather boot that had once been part of a pair and nestled at the very bottom, a silver locket she had completely forgotten she owned. The locket was tarnished with age and neglect, but when she managed to pry it open with trembling fingers, the faces that stared back at her were like lightning striking her memory. A man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, his arm around a woman whose features were hauntingly similar to Hina's own. The woman wore a dress of blue calico that matched the torn fabric perfectly, and her expression radiated the sort of love that transcends time and tragedy. These were her parents, Thomas and Margaret Whitman, captured forever in a moment of happiness that had ended in blood and fire on a desert trail. The shock of recognition sent Hina reeling backward, the locket falling from nerveless fingers to land in the dust at her feet. Suddenly, fragments of memory began forcing their way to the surface, her father's voice singing hymns as their wagon rolled west, her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair each morning, the sound of her own name being called with love and laughter. Rosalie. She had been Rosalie Whitman, daughter of people who had loved her completely and died trying to protect her. When Yaholo found her an hour later, she was sitting exactly where she had fallen, staring at the opened locket with tears streaming down her face. He took in the scene immediately, the scattered belongings, the photograph, the expression of anguish on the face of the child he had come to love as his own daughter. "You remember them," he said quietly, settling beside her with the patience of a man who understood that some conversations could not be rushed. Hina, Rosalie, looked up at him with eyes that held a confusion deeper than childhood should ever have to bear. "They were my family," she whispered in English, the language feeling strange in her mouth after years of Apache. "Before you. They were my first family." Yaholo nodded gravely. "Yes, they loved you very much. They died protecting you. Why didn't you tell me?" The question was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a child's fundamental need to understand the world around her. "You were dying when I found you," Yaholo said carefully. "Your body was dying, and your spirit was dying too. Remembering the pain might have finished what the desert started. We thought, Nayeli and I thought, that letting you heal was more important than making you remember suffering." She picked up the locket again, studying the faces of the parents she had once known as completely, as she now knew Yaholo and Nayeli. "I loved them," she said, and it was both a statement and a question, as if she needed permission to hold love for two families simultaneously. "Of course you did. Love doesn't end just because people die. Your first parents will always be part of who you are." Yaholo reached out to touch her shoulder gently. "But love doesn't have limits either. You can love them and still love us. The heart is big enough for all the people who deserve to live there." That night, Hina lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the wickiup, the silver locket pressed against her chest. In her mind, two sets of memories competed for attention: the Apache songs Nayeli had taught her and the hymns her father had hummed, the desert survival skills that had become second nature, and dim recollections of a gentler life in green places where water flowed freely. For the first time since her naming ceremony, she wondered about the life she might have lived if the raiders had never come. Would she be in California now, helping her mother tend a garden while her father built the farm they had dreamed about during those long wagon train days? Would she even remember how to speak Apache? Or would this desert life seem like nothing more than a strange dream? The identity crisis deepened over the following weeks. Hina found herself studying her reflection in still water, trying to see traces of the white parents in features that had been shaped by years of desert sun and Apache upbringing. She began having dreams, not the nightmares of the massacre that had plagued her early months in the camp, but gentler visions of a life that might have been Nayeli. With the intuitive wisdom of a woman who had mothered many children, recognized the signs of internal struggle. Instead of trying to distract Hina from her questions, she encouraged them, understanding that identity was something that had to be built consciously, not simply assumed. "You are both," she said one evening as they sat together working on a new dress for Hina's growing frame. "You are the child born to Thomas and Margaret Whitman, and you are the daughter raised by Yaholo and me. Both of these truths live in you. Neither cancels out the other. But what if white people come looking for me?" Hina asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart. "What if they say I have to go back to being Rosalie?" It was the question everyone in the camp had been dreading, because scouts had been bringing increasingly troubling reports. Army patrols were expanding their search patterns, asking more detailed questions about missing white captives. Most ominously, there were rumors of a new colonel at Fort Apache who was conducting a systematic review of every disappearance from the past 5 years. Nayeli set down her sewing and pulled Hina close. "If that day comes, we will face it together. But remember this, no one can force you to stop being who you have chosen to become. You are Apache in your heart, in your spirit, in the way you see the world. That cannot be taken from you, even if your body is forced to go somewhere else." The silver locket lay heavy against Hina's chest as she absorbed these words, a tangible reminder that the past had a way of reclaiming its own, whether the present was ready or not. Somewhere in the vast territory beyond their hidden canyon, Colonel James Whitman was getting closer to answers he had been seeking for 3 years. And when those two worlds finally collided, a young girl who had learned to love twice would be forced to choose where her loyalty truly lay. The military dispatch arrived in the camp through the most unlikely of messengers, a young Apache scout named Kaya who had been trading horses at the fort and overheard conversations that chilled him to the bone. He had memorized every word of the document he glimpsed on the colonel's desk, and now he sat in the center of the tribal council, delivering news that would change everything. "The colonel's name is James Whitman," Kaya reported, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had discovered. "He seeks his brother's child, a girl named Rosalie Whitman, age 6 when taken from a wagon train 3 years ago. The paper says he has authorization from Washington to use any force necessary to retrieve white captives from hostile tribes." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present understood the terrible irony. The man leading the search for Hina was her blood relative, her father's own brother. But more than that, they recognized the name from their own painful history. Yaholo's face had gone ashen, and his hand moved instinctively to his medicine pouch. "James Whitman," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. "Colonel James Whitman of the 7th Cavalry." Hatali, sensing the deeper significance, leaned forward. "You know this name, brother?" "I know this name." Yaholo's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the accumulated grief of 15 years. "Colonel James Whitman commanded the troops that attacked our winter camp in 1858. He gave the orders that killed my wife, my children, my world." The revelation struck the council like a physical blow. The symmetry was so cruel, it seemed designed by malevolent spirits. The man who had destroyed Yaholo's family was now coming to reclaim the child who had given Yaholo reason to live again. The same hands that had signed orders for the massacre of Apache innocents were now demanding the return of a white innocent who had found peace among the people he had tried to destroy. Kuruk was the first to speak, his voice thick with anger. "This is what comes of keeping the white child. The spirits mock us with this bitter joke. The murderer of your family now comes for the daughter of your heart." But Hatali raised a weathered hand for silence. "Perhaps this is not mockery but opportunity. The man who took everything from Yaholo, what would he give to have his brother's child returned safely? What price would he pay for the life that was saved when his own actions brought only death?" Nayeli, who had been silent throughout the council, finally spoke. "What does it matter what he would pay? Hina is not a trade good to be bartered. She is our daughter, our family, and she is also his blood," Cochetta said gently. "The last connection he has to a brother he will never see again. Can we ignore that truth simply because it is inconvenient?" Yaholo stood and walked to the edge of the council circle, staring out at the desert where he had found a dying child 3 years ago. The medicine pouch around his neck seemed heavier than usual, weighted with memories of his murdered family and the impossible choice now facing him. "There is more," Kaya continued reluctantly. "The colonel believes the child was taken captive against her will. He thinks she is being held by force, that her mind has been poisoned against her own people. He comes not to negotiate, but to rescue what he believes is a white girl being held prisoner by savages." The word savages hung in the air like a curse. It was the term white people used to justify every atrocity, every broken treaty, every act of violence against Apache families. Now it would be used to justify tearing a healed child away from the only family she truly remembered. "How long before he arrives?" Yaholo asked without turning around. "His regiment left Fort Apache yesterday morning. If they follow the most direct route, they will be here in 4 days." 4 days. Yaholo closed his eyes and saw 2 possible futures stretching ahead like diverging trails. In one, they could pack up the camp and disappear deeper into the mountains, taking Hina with them and keeping their family intact through running and hiding. In the other, he could choose to face the man who had destroyed his life and offer him the gift of redemption, the safe return of a child who had been loved and protected when she could have been abandoned to die. When he turned back to the council, his decision was written in the lines of his weathered face. "I will meet with Colonel Whitman. Alone." "No," Nayeli said immediately, rising to her feet. "If you go, we go together. She is my daughter too." "And mine," Hina said from the entrance to the circle, where she had been listening despite attempts to keep her away from adult discussions. At 10 years old, she had learned to move silently enough to overhear conversations that concerned her future, and she had heard enough to understand that her 2 worlds were about to collide. The adults turned to look at her. This child, who had somehow become the center of forces much larger than any of them could control. She stood straight and proud, wearing the traditional dress Nayeli had made for her. Her blonde hair braided with silver ornaments, the eagle feather from her naming ceremony still woven into the intricate pattern. "Uncle James," she said slowly, testing the English words. "My father's brother. He comes to take me back. He comes believing he is rescuing you," Yaholo said carefully. "He does not understand that you chose to stay, that you found family here." Hina fingered the silver locket she now wore openly, the faces of her birth parents visible against her chest alongside the Apache ornaments that marked her current identity. "What if I tell him I want to stay? What if I explain that you saved me, that you became my father when I had no father?" It was Karuk who answered, his voice gentler than usual. "White men do not always listen to children, even when those children speak truth. And they do not always believe that Apache can show kindness rather than cruelty. Then I will make him listen," Hina said, with the fierce determination that had carried her through the transformation from terrified captive to confident Apache daughter. "I will make him understand." As the council continued through the night, debating strategies and possibilities, none of them could have imagined the full extent of the challenge they would face. Colonel James Whitman was not just any army officer seeking a missing child. He was a man driven by guilt and grief over his failure to protect his brother's family. A man who had spent 3 years blaming himself for not insisting they delay their westward journey until military escorts were available. In his mind, rescuing Rosalie would not just restore his brother's child to civilization, it would somehow balance the scales of a universe that had taken too much from the Whitman family. He was prepared to use any amount of force necessary to achieve this redemption, because in his worldview, no white child could truly choose to remain with Indians when given the option to return to her own kind. The collision between these 2 forms of love, Apache and white, chosen and blood, was now inevitable. In 4 days, 3 years of healing and growth would be put to the ultimate test, and a young girl who had learned to bridge 2 worlds would be forced to choose which world would claim her future. The war lance had belonged to Yaholo's father and his father before him, passed down through generations of Apache warriors who had used it to defend their people against every enemy that had ever threatened their way of life. Now, as Yaholo held the ancient weapon in his weathered hands, he felt the weight of all those ancestral spirits watching him face the most important decision of his life. The lance was beautiful. In its deadly simplicity, a 7-foot shaft of hardened oak topped with a steel point that had been forged by his grandfather from metal taken from defeated Mexican soldiers. Eagle feathers hung from the shaft just below the point, and the entire weapon was wrapped with sacred symbols that told the story of his family's warrior tradition. It represented everything he had been raised to be: protector, fighter, defender of the Apache way. But as he sat in his wickiup on the night before Colonel Whitman's expected arrival, Yaholo found himself questioning everything that weapon symbolized. Violence had taken his first family from him. Violence had driven his people from their ancestral lands time and again. Violence had created the endless cycle of hatred and revenge that kept Apache and White locked in a dance of mutual destruction. Tomorrow, he could take up his father's lance and fight for the right to keep Hinar as his daughter. He could gather the warriors of the camp and make Colonel Whitman's regiment pay dearly for any attempt to take her by force. The old Yaholo, the man he had been before Itzel and the children died, might have chosen exactly that path. But the man he had become through loving and raising a white child saw other possibilities. What if there was a way to break the cycle? What if the very forces that had brought Hina into his life were offering him a chance to transform hatred into understanding? "You're thinking too much," Nayeli said softly, entering the wickiup with a bowl of venison stew. "I can hear the wheels turning in your head from across the camp." Yaholo accepted the food gratefully, though he had little appetite. "I keep seeing my children's faces. Delnish would be 23 now, a warrior in his prime. Ayana would be 20, probably with babies of her own." He paused, struggling with emotions that never got easier to bear. "What would they want me to do tomorrow?" Nayeli settled beside him, her presence a comfort that had sustained him through many dark nights over the past 3 years. "Your children were raised to honor life above all else. You taught them that true strength comes from protecting the innocent, not from destroying enemies." "But she is innocent too," Yaholo said, gesturing toward the wickiup where he now slept restlessly, her dreams troubled by the approaching confrontation. "And taking her from us will destroy something beautiful that grew from all that ugliness." Outside, the camp was unusually quiet. Everyone understood that tomorrow would bring changes that could not be undone, and the weight of that knowledge pressed down on them like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. Children who usually played until late had been put to bed early. Adults spoke in whispers, if they spoke at all. In her own wickiup, Hina lay staring at the stars visible through the smoke hole in the roof. The silver locket lay open beside her, and she found herself memorizing her birth parents' faces as if she might forget them again. Thomas Whitman had his brother's eyes. She could see that even in the small daguerreotype. James Whitman would look at her and see his lost brother reflected in her features, just as she now saw echoes of a man she barely remembered. The complexity of her situation wasn't lost on her, even at 10 years old. She loved Yaholo and Nayeli as completely as any daughter could love her parents. They had saved her life, raised her with patience and kindness, given her a place to belong when everything familiar had been torn away. The Apache camp was home in every way that mattered, but she also understood, with the painful clarity that trauma sometimes brings to young minds, that her presence had put everyone she loved at risk. If Colonel Whitman came with soldiers ready for battle, people would die defending her right to stay. Apache warriors would fall fighting for a white child, and their families would grieve because she had been too selfish to prevent it. The thought tormented her as she tried to sleep. What if the best thing she could do for her Apache family was to leave them? What if loving them meant accepting that love sometimes requires sacrifice? 3 wickiups away, Kuruk sharpened his weapons with mechanical precision, preparing for what he assumed would be an inevitable battle. He had never fully trusted the decision to keep the white child, and now his fears were proving justified. Soldiers were coming just as he had predicted. and Apache blood would likely be spilled before the sun set tomorrow. But even Kuruk, despite his misgivings about Hina's presence in the camp, had come to care for the bright, curious child who had asked him endless questions about tracking and hunting. She reminded him of his own daughter, killed in a cavalry raid 5 years earlier, and the thought of her being dragged away, screaming to a world she no longer understood, filled him with protective rage. As the night wore on, individuals throughout the camp wrestled with their own impossible choices. Some thought they should pack up and flee deeper into the mountains before dawn. Others believed they should stand and fight, defending their right to live free from white interference. A few wondered if there might be some way to negotiate, though most doubted that soldiers came prepared for anything but force. Dawn broke grey and cloudy, with the smell of rain heavy in the air. It seemed fitting weather for a day that would test every bond and belief they had built over the years of hiding in their desert sanctuary. Yaholo rose early and walked to the highest point overlooking their camp, scanning the horizons for signs of approaching riders. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and dangerous and indifferent to human struggles. Somewhere out there, Colonel James Whitman was leading his regiment toward what he believed would be a rescue mission. He had no idea he was riding toward the man who had raised his brother's child with more love and care than many children ever receive from their blood relatives. When Hina found him there, standing silent as stone against the morning sky, she didn't speak immediately. Instead, she simply stood beside him, offering the comfort of presence that had become second nature between them over the years of their shared life. "I've been thinking," she said finally, her English rusty from disuse but clear enough. "Maybe I should go with him. Maybe that's what's supposed to happen." Yaholo's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Is that what you want?" "No," she admitted. "I want to stay here forever, with you and Nayeli and everyone who loves me. But I don't want people to die because of me. And maybe Uncle James needs to know that Thomas Whitman's daughter is alive and well. Maybe he needs to see that Apache people can love a white child as much as any white family could." The wisdom in her words struck Yaholo like a physical blow. This child, this 10-year-old girl who had endured trauma that would break many adults, was thinking beyond her own desires to consider the greater implications of her choice. She was willing to sacrifice her own happiness to prevent violence and perhaps even to build bridges between two peoples who had known nothing but conflict. As the sun climbed higher and the sound of approaching horses finally reached their ears, Yaholo made his own choice. He would not take up his father's war lance. He would not gather the warriors for a battle that could only end in more grief. Instead, he would trust in the power of truth, in the possibility that even old enemies could recognize love when they saw it clearly. The column of blue uniforms was visible now, riding hard across the desert floor toward their hidden camp. At its head rode a man whose bearing and determination marked him unmistakably as Colonel James Whitman, come to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. In less than an hour, 3 years of healing would face its ultimate test, and a young girl who had learned to love beyond the boundaries of race and culture would discover whether the world was ready to accept the family she had chosen. The family photograph trembled in Colonel James Whitman's gloved hand as he sat astride his horse, staring at the Apache camp spread out below them in the protected canyon. The daguerreotype showed his brother Thomas with Margaret and little Rosalie, taken just before their departure for California 3 years ago. It was the only image he had of the niece he had been searching for, with the desperate determination of a man seeking redemption. Beside him, Lieutenant Morrison shifted uneasily in his saddle. "Sir, should we surround the camp before making contact? If they're holding the child against her will—" "No," Whitman said firmly, never taking his eyes off the wiki-ups below. "We go in under a flag of truce first. If my brother's daughter is down there, I want her to see that we came in peace, not as conquerors." But peace was a relative term when 30 armed cavalry soldiers rode into an Apache settlement. As the column descended into the canyon, Whitman could see the camp's residents emerging from their dwellings, and he noted with professional interest that while some warriors were visible, no one appeared to be preparing for immediate battle. Either this was an elaborate trap, or these Apache were not behaving like the savage captors he had expected to find. Yaholo stood waiting in the center of the camp, flanked by Nayeli and several tribal elders. His posture was erect but not threatening, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. When his eyes met Colonel Whitman's across the dusty space that separated two worlds, both men felt the shock of recognition that comes when enemies finally see each other as human beings rather than symbols. "I am Colonel James Whitman of the United States Army," the officer announced, his voice carrying the authority of rank and the weight of personal anguish. "I seek information about a white child taken from a wagon train attack 3 years ago. A girl named Rosalie Whitman." "I am Yaholo," came the calm reply in accented but clear English. "The child you seek is safe. She has been under my protection since I found her dying in the desert." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both men understood immediately. This Apache warrior was claiming to have saved, not captured, the child Whitman had spent 3 years believing was being held prisoner. "Where is she?" Whitman demanded, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "If you've harmed one hair on her head, Papa Yaholo hasn't harmed me." The voice came from behind the group of elders, clear and confident, and speaking English with just the slightest accent that marked years of bilingual upbringing. As the Apache adult stepped aside, Hina walked forward with the poise of a young woman who belonged exactly where she was. Colonel Whitman's breath caught in his throat. The child before him was unmistakably his brother's daughter, the same blonde hair, the same blue eyes, the same stubborn set to her jaw that had characterized the Whitman family for generations. But everything else about her spoke of a life lived far from the civilization he had expected to find her yearning for. She wore traditional Apache clothing that fit her perfectly, her hair braided in intricate patterns, adorned with silver ornaments. Most shocking of all, she moved with the confident grace of someone completely at home in her surroundings, showing none of the fear or desperate gratitude he had expected from a rescued captive. "Rosalie," he whispered, dismounting from his horse and taking a hesitant step forward. "I am called Hina now," she replied, though not unkindly. "She who survives. But yes, I was Rosalie Whitman before the raiders killed my first family, her first family." The phrase struck Whitman like a physical blow. This child, his brother's daughter, was speaking of her white parents as her first family, implying that she had found a second one among these Apache people. "My dear girl," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I've been searching for you for 3 years. We thought you were dead, or—" He gestured helplessly at the Apache camp around them, "or captured by savages who would torture and corrupt me." Hina finished gently. "Uncle James, these people saved my life when your people's war left me orphaned and dying. Yaholo found me and brought me home. Nayeli fed me and taught me and loved me back to life. They became my family when I had no family." The use of his family title, uncle, spoken so casually by this child who looked like his brother but spoke like an Apache, created a cognitive. The sacred peace pipe had been crafted by Yaholo's grandfather from red pipestone, quarried in the sacred Black Hills. Its bowl carved with symbols representing the 4 directions and the eternal circle of life. As Yaholo brought it forth from his medicine pouch, Colonel Whitman instinctively reached for his sidearm, misinterpreting the gesture as a potential threat. "Easy, Colonel," Yaholo said softly, holding the pipe where everyone could see it clearly. "This is not a weapon. It is an offering of peace, a way for enemies to sit together and speak truth without bloodshed." Lieutenant Morrison leaned forward in his saddle, his hand on his rifle. "Sir, we shouldn't trust any Apache ritual. This could be some kind of trap." But Colonel Whitman found himself studying the intricate carvings on the pipe, recognizing the craftsmanship and spiritual significance even through his military training. More importantly, he was beginning to see something in Yaholo's weathered face that challenged his preconceptions about Apache, character and intentions. "You offer to smoke with the man whose orders killed your family 15 years ago," Whitman said quietly. The words carrying weight he hadn't intended to reveal. Yaholo's eyes flickered with surprise, then understanding. "You remember the winter camp at Bear Creek Canyon? You remember the orders you gave that morning?" "I remember everything," Whitman replied, his voice thick with old guilt. "I remember believing we were striking at a hostile war party. I remember learning too late that we had attacked families, women, children, elders who had never raised arms against anyone." The admission hung between them like smoke from the peace pipe Yaholo had not yet lit. Around them, both Apache and soldiers listened to this unexpected moment of honesty between old enemies. "Your wife," Whitman continued, "your children, they died because of my orders. And now you've spent 3 years raising my brother's daughter as your own. Why? Why would you save the family of the man who destroyed yours?" Ina stepped forward, understanding that this moment required her voice more than anyone else's. "Because that's who he is, Uncle James. Papa Yaholo doesn't let hatred make his choices. When he found me dying in the desert, he didn't see the niece of his enemy. He saw a child who needed help. That's the difference between you and him." The words struck Whitman like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. This 10-year-old girl, his brother's daughter, had identified the fundamental difference between the Apache way of thinking and his own military worldview. "I came here to rescue you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I came here believing you were being held prisoner, that you needed saving from people who had stolen you from your rightful life. And instead you find that they saved me from certain death and gave me a rightful life." Hina replied gently. "Uncle James, I know this is hard to understand, but love isn't limited by the color of skin or the culture we're born into. These people became my family not because they captured me, but because they chose to love me when I had nothing left to love me back." Yaholo struck a match and lit the sacred pipe, the sweet smoke of kinnikinnick and sage rising into the desert air. "Colonel, your niece speaks wisdom beyond her years. She has taught me that healing is possible even when hatred seems justified. Perhaps she can teach the same lesson to both our peoples." As the pipe was passed from hand to hand, each person taking the sacred smoke and releasing it to carry their prayers to the spirits, something fundamental shifted in the dynamics of the confrontation. This was no longer a rescue mission opposed by hostile captors. It had become a family discussion about the nature of love, loyalty and belonging. "I don't understand how this works," Whitman admitted after taking his turn with the pipe. "I don't understand how she can love both families, both worlds. I don't understand how you can forgive what I did to your people. Forgiveness is not forgetting," Yaholo said carefully. "It is choosing to plant corn instead of poison in the ground where evil things have happened. Your niece is the corn that grew from the poisoned ground of our mutual losses. She proves that love can grow anywhere if it is tended with patience and hope." Hina moved to stand between the two men, her small hands reaching out to touch both of them. "Uncle James, I will come visit you and Aunt Catherine. I want to know about my father's family, about where I came from. But I also want you to understand where I choose to live, who I choose to love. Can you accept that I'm big enough to love everyone who deserves my love?" Looking down at this remarkable child who had somehow learned to bridge worlds that had been at war for generations, Colonel Whitman felt something crack open in his chest, the rigid certainty that had guided his military career, the assumption that there could be only one right way to live, one acceptable choice for a white child to make. "I don't know if I can accept it," he said honestly, "but I can try to understand it." The peace pipe completed its circle, carrying with it the possibility that understanding might be enough to prevent the violence that had seemed inevitable just an hour before. 5 years had passed since that tense morning when two worlds collided in a hidden Apache canyon, and the wedding ring that Nayeli now wore, crafted from silver and Turquoise in the traditional Apache style caught the afternoon. Sunlight as she prepared the evening meal for her expanded family. The ring had been Yaholo's wedding gift to her when they formally married 3 years ago, but its true significance lay in what it represented. The eternal bond of a family that had been chosen rather than born, forged through love rather than blood, strengthened through trials that would have shattered lesser connections. Around their cooking fire sat the living proof of that bond's success. Hina, now 15 and beautiful in the way of young women who have known both hardship and joy, helped her younger siblings with their evening lessons. 2-year-old Nalnish, named for Yaholo's lost son, babbled happily in her lap, while 4-year-old Ayana, whose name honored Yaholo's lost daughter, practiced drawing Apache symbols in the dust with a stick. These children had never known a world where their blonde, blue-eyed older sister was anything other than Apache family. To them, she was simply Hina, the sister who told the best stories, who could track a rabbit through rocky terrain, and who somehow managed to make even their father laugh when his memories grew too heavy. But Hina was much more than just a big sister now. Over the 5 years since Colonel Whitman's visit, she had become something unprecedented in the long history of Apache-white relations. A bridge between two peoples who had known nothing but conflict and misunderstanding. The arrangement that had eventually emerged from that day of crisis had satisfied no one completely, but it had worked better than anyone had dared hope. Colonel Whitman had returned to Fort Apache with a report that challenged every assumption his superiors held about Apache treatment of white captives. His niece, he wrote, had not been brainwashed or coerced. She had been genuinely loved and raised with care that equaled or exceeded what many white children received from their own families. Rather than demanding her immediate return to white society, Whitman had negotiated an unprecedented agreement. Hina would spend several months each year at Fort Apache, learning about her birth culture and maintaining connections to the Whitman family legacy. The rest of the time, she would remain with her Apache family, continuing to grow in the traditions and knowledge that had shaped her from childhood. The arrangement had been controversial on both sides. Many in the army viewed it as capitulation to hostile Indians, while some Apache traditionalists saw it as dangerous exposure to white corruption. But the results spoke for themselves. Hina had not only thrived under this dual existence, she had become an invaluable translator and mediator whenever conflicts arose between the two cultures. Her ability to speak both languages fluently, to understand both worldviews intimately, had already prevented several skirmishes that might have escalated into full-scale warfare. When Apache hunting parties were accused of stealing cattle, Hina could explain the traditional understanding of land use that made such accusations meaningless to her people. When white settlers complained about savage behavior, she could translate the cultural contexts that transformed apparent hostility into misunderstood courtesy. More remarkably, she had begun teaching Apache children English and white children basic Apache phrases, creating the foundation for a generation that might understand each other better than their parents ever could. Her small schoolhouse, built on neutral ground between the fort and the Apache camp, had become a symbol of possibility that attracted visitors from across the territory. On this particular evening, as the family gathered for their meal, Hina reflected on how perfectly her life had balanced itself between two worlds. Tomorrow, she would leave for her annual 3-month stay at Fort Apache, where Uncle James and Aunt Catherine waited with their own form of love and their own lessons to teach. She would sleep in a soft bed, wear white women's clothing, and practice the social graces expected of a young lady in territorial society. But she would also miss the desert sunrises from their canyon home, the sound of Yaholo's morning prayers, the feel of Nayeli's hands braiding her hair in the traditional patterns that marked her as Apache family. She would miss her little brother's laughter, and her little sister's endless questions about everything from bird calls to star patterns. The beauty of her life now was that she didn't have to choose between these loves anymore. She could be both Rosalie Whitman, beloved niece of a respected army colonel, and Hina, cherished daughter of Apache parents who had saved her from death and despair. She could honor the memory of her birth parents while celebrating the daily presence of the parents who had raised her from brokenness back to wholeness. As they shared their evening meal, Yaholo looked across the fire at the young woman who had taught him that healing was possible even in the midst of loss. She had grown strong and wise, capable of moving between worlds that most people saw as irreconcilably different. More importantly, she had retained the compassion that made such bridge building possible. "Tomorrow you leave us again for the white world," he said, his English much improved after years of practice with her lessons. "But you will always carry our love with you, just as you carry theirs when you return to us." Hina smiled, understanding that this was as close as her Apache father would come to expressing how much he would miss her during their months apart. "And I will always come home to you," she replied in Apache, using the words that had become their ritual farewell. "Because love creates the strongest families, and we are bound by love that nothing can break." The wedding ring caught the firelight as Nayeli reached across to squeeze her daughter's hand, and in that simple gesture lay the promise that had sustained them through 5 years of challenges and changes. That family was not about blood or culture or the circumstances of birth, but about the choice to love and keep loving, no matter what the world might demand. Above them, the desert stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, witnesses to the small miracle of a family that had been forged in the crucible of loss and had emerged stronger than anything that might still try to tear them apart.